Robbie Lawler was out of control.
This is Double Cross, the murder of Robbie Lawler.
It was going to be an all-out war with him in the middle of it.
Crime World special investigation podcast based on my new book, Web of Betrayal, wherever you get your podcasts. We're actually rolling because there's new lights on the cameras, so we now can see where the cameras are looking, which kind of confuses us, but it'll be fine. We're going forth to 2025.
Yeah.
Much more high-tech than when we started.
We absolutely are. If you think back, I mean, what date did Crime World start? Do you remember?
Crime World started in 2020, I think. November, the end of 2020, in my kitchen.
I do. I remember it well.
And Ian was so annoying because he used to find the fridge really irritating. Yeah. The noise of it.
Well, there was, I mean...
We used to pull out the plug of my fridge and then we'd forget completely to put it back in, and later that evening I'd go and find...
the first year of Crime World.
Find my wine wasn't chilled. It was a nightmare.
Whatever. It's a tough life. But no, you'd find that the email sound, the sound of an email dropping is a constant feature for the first year of Crime World. But we are more high-tech.
Yeah.
And for sure at this point, you know.
Yeah, and look, 2024 was a great year for Crime World. I suppose we've upped the content provided because you can just feel that it's been listened to, it's been watched. Everybody seems to be interested in it.
Yeah.
There's a never-ending supply of things to talk about.
Which is amazing, like, because we're doing so many episodes and it's always a matter of leaving things out rather than we can't find anything to talk about.
I just feel like I'm constantly sort of coming down from the third floor with papers and looking really disorganised. Actually, one of my New Year's resolutions, and I said this to Emer as well, was for us to just look a little bit more organised, a bit more elegant, you know? Just a bit more elegant.
Is that just for you, or do I have to? I have to look elegant.
You're perfect anyway, but me and Emer in particular, and we need to stop this carrying of the bags and bent over and having all sorts of laptops and this, that and the other. Anyway, we're going to go through the year and really what interested people. And it's a bit of a, you know, a walk down a very sort of dark memory lane, shall we say, when you do this, because you talk about these stories all the time and then you kind of go, did that only happen this year? Or did that happen all that time ago?
Yeah.
Now, January we're looking at.
So January, I think there was two, it was right after the shooting in Brown's Steakhouse, which was such a...
Big story of January was that shooting and the fears around retaliation and the sort of tensions in the Blanchardstown area.
Yeah.
So we'll remind ourselves what happened?
Well, I mean, just nearly 12 months ago now at this stage, two men went into a restaurant in Blanchardstown area, one of them carrying a gun. A man was shot. Jason Hennessy Sr. was shot in front of his family and friends, where a big group of people had been having a Christmas party on Christmas Eve. That man then tried to flee, but was subdued, I suppose you could say, by the crowd, and ultimately died as a result of injuries he suffered. Tristan Sherry was his name, and it was part of an ongoing feud, I suppose, in the area. Jason Hennessy Sr. was involved in criminality, an older man who, older than some of the people he was there with. And I suppose in Irish legal terms, it's quite incredible that as we approach that year anniversary, much of the legal proceedings around it are literally coming to an end as we speak. There's closing speeches in the Special Criminal Court for a number of people who have been charged broadly in relation to their alleged roles in the death of Tristan Sherry. So it was a story. You know, if you look at an Irish, stories can be big in Ireland, but there's one way to see if it's a big story, I suppose, and that's log on to the Daily Mail in the UK, because, you know, it led that news site for really over Christmas, because I suppose of just the level of ferocity of attacking somebody on those circumstances on that night.
Narco style again,
yes,
isn't it? And we say that about the murder and the dismemberment of Cian Mulready Woods, but it's like something that shouldn't be happening in sophisticated European capitals.
Yeah, and it's...
You know, it's like really is like something from far, far away.
Yeah.
And when it happens in Ireland, in the Netherlands, whatever, it is big international news because of that fact that it's sort of that terrorism style of drug gangs fighting as opposed to anything else. I'm just thinking, Christmas Eve is such a night or day. You kind of remember what you're doing on Christmas Eve. We all give out about Christmas and all the preparations and how ridiculous it is, how everyone goes over the top. But it's kind of a night, I think, you've memories from. And if you cast your mind back, you can at least kind of remember where you were, what you were doing that day. And most of us were probably at home. Preparing, having a glass, whatever we were doing, friends in. The amount of lives that were changed by that incident that night in Blanchardstown is phenomenal. And I mean, we talk about, so Jason Hennessy is dead, Tristan Sherry is dead. There's a number of very young men before the courts facing, jail, and probably, if they're found guilty, and probably, a sort of, they've entered the legal system, haven't they, or the criminal justice system. So their lives have changed forever as well. But there was loads more people there that night. There was people with their families. There was people with children. There was people fleeing, we saw on the mobile phones. There was people working there. That business has shut down.
Yeah.
Huge amount of lives affected.
Yeah.
Many of them blighted. I'm sure the trauma of so many people.
Yes, and of course Jason Hennessy Sr.'s family spoke at his inquest earlier this year. They were, very upset, obviously, to state the obvious, but also angry. They expressed anger in the courthouse. But you're right, even Brown's Steakhouse is gone. There was even a WRC case, a Workplace Relations Commission case about about unpaid wages for a person who had worked there, because, it obviously had shut down in the aftermath. So the ripple effects are huge, obviously, on the people. They are. And look,
Jason Hennessy, in a way, he was an adult man as well, amongst children almost, And he chose a life of crime, and he actively chose that life, right? But it was the people who didn't at all choose that and who've been touched with. I did meet somebody who knew somebody that was there, that I don't want to go into details about exactly who it was, but somebody who was there. And it was his wife, actually. And he said she is absolutely changed forever.
Yeah.
So traumatized, isn't working since, and has various other issues like that. And he's sort of doing his best to try and to hope that, as time goes on and a bit of counselling and stuff. But
if you look at Tristan Sherry, who, while he'd been involved in criminality for a long time, this is not a man that's, infamous on the streets of Ireland, along like somebody like Robbie Lawler. So it just shows you what sort of mentality.
And what was the mentality? What was going on in his head?
Well, look, there'd been, as far as we know, there'd been incidents with associates of Jason Hennessy Sr. over a long period of time. There'd been a falling out. There'd been, a degree of constant conflict, some of it quite violent. So he's obviously been driven by that, I would imagine.
Yeah.
This isn't a guy who's a hitman for hire or anything like that. He's been driven by his own circumstances. But it just shows you that these people, for a start, they have to have access to weaponry. They have to have access to a degree of planning, though clearly not a lot of planning went into that.
Who could decide to go into
what sort of
packed restaurant on a Christmas Eve to carry out a gangland shooting? If you have I always sort of mention that, I suppose, in a way, sometimes what the photographers do is not unlike what an assassin can do, because you're looking to get a clear shot of somebody and put yourself in a position where you're most likely to get that. But if you have somebody, they're in a place, they're in a restaurant in particular, they're not in a house, they have to come out.
They have to come out.
If you position yourself as a photographer, you have a high likelihood of getting a photograph of that person.
See, if you remember the murder of Eamon Dunn, the Don, I think there was, I can't remember the exact number of people, but there was a spotter. Yeah. There was 4 people went in. One of them stayed at the door, one of the masked men, held the door. Other people cleared the way. A gunman went up.
A highly skilled
gunman.
Highly.
Went
and trained.
Took him out. But it wasn't just him. They were masked up.
Yeah.
They had a spotter. They made sure they had an escape route. They had
and they
cars.
knew who was there because, I mean, I think that night Dunn
they knew not just
Dunn had his daughter beside him. He was not going to be in any position to do anything.
They didn't. They knew exactly where he was sitting. They walked in. They got out. So that was carried out by the Kinahan hit team. Some of the most infamous names in Irish gangland carried that out. But what you see with Tristan Sherry here is chaos. This opportunity is obviously become aware that Jason Hennessy Sr. is in there. But there's no real planning or even was he going to get away with it? I mean, was he going to walk out? And even if he had walked out, everybody had seen him.
Yeah.
Was he going to get away with it in the criminal justice system or in terms of his rivals? And that's, I suppose, some of the realities of gangland. There is really two gangland. There's an organised crime element, which is much more rare than disorganised, chaotic, criminal figures that are operating in that criminal underworld.
I mean, that's sounding like a scenario where somebody is radicalised to the extent, radicalised in the criminal underworld to the extent that they are willing, you know what I mean? They're willing to put themselves in a position that their own life is also in that kind of critical danger.
But it's also, I suppose, indicative of a mentality where people have no capacity to think through the consequences of their actions at times, whether that's driven by anger or fear. But, it is an amazing phenomenon that you see in gangland and in other bits of criminality where people are clearly, not able to control They're
also using a lot of product themselves, a lot of these young guys, and that just, you do not think clearly. In particular, cocaine seems to have a very chaotic effect on certain people.
Yeah.
Not everyone, but it certainly does make certain people very violent, very sort of, exactly like that scenario that they're kind of, they're going into some situation that you're kind of going, where was your mind? Anyway.
So that was dominated.
Was January. And of course,
we
also had Liam Byrne appearing in the Old Bailey. So he had been returned from Spain.
Yeah.
And that was the beginning of that case that we've only covered there recently, which was Bomber's attempt to lessen his own sentence in this gun plot.
We also had the number one episode of January was The Life and Crimes of Mr. Flashy.
So what was he at that stage?
Well, you see that a part of that discussion, if I remember correctly, which I probably don't, but that also fed into the Brown's bar or the Brown Steakhouse shooting, because these complicated web of feuding in that part of West Dublin, that flashy Mr. Flashy outfit, seeped into all of those feuds that occurred across Coolock, Corduff, and in Blanchardstown. His tentacles, and of course Tristan Sherry was somebody who was very much an associate of Mr. Flashy, if not in that core of his gang. So Mr. Flashy has his role in those things is always of interest to people. Obviously, things have gone quiet for various reasons regarding Mr. Flashy, but I would imagine 2025 will be talking about him again.
Absolutely, no doubt. Now, moving on to February, and of course, the big story of February was Mexico to Kerry.
Yeah.
Inside the Irish wing of the Sinaloa Cartel. Who would have ever thought there would have been a headline like that?
Yeah.
So in February, we had the 30 million euro worth of meth seized in Cork and linked to this Irish wing of the Sinaloa Cartel. Yet again, interesting, you mentioned the Special Criminal Court, and it's obviously, there must have been that backlog must have been cleared up, because we have already had somebody in connection with all this already through and
awaiting
Leading.
sort of sentencing,
Yeah.
effectively. Yeah, so I think what happened with the Special Criminal Court was during the Hutch-Kinahan feud, there was a huge amount of people sent to the Special Criminal Court, and ultimately more resources were put in terms of judges, really.
There was
And more-
2 courts opened.
Yes, exactly. So there was a huge backlog, and probably now we're in a position where that backlog, the Hutch-Kinahan feud prosecutions are, I mean, I'm trying to think, is there any still there in the Irish courts? There probably is some, but the vast majority of them are totally done. People have been sentenced, and some of them are already coming out of prison.
Yeah, exactly.
So there probably was that extra capacity, so we've seen that. But the Sinaloa, Kerry, again, like, you know, there's no mystery about why people are interested in this story. Like,
No. And let's just go back and remind ourselves of the story. It starts with a young guy growing up in Killorglin.
Yes, who had been born in Mexico to an Irish father and a Mexican mother, had lived his early life in Mexico, in Sinaloa, which I'm sure is a beautiful part of Mexico, but is, for most people, is only synonymous with the Sinaloa Cartel led by El Chapo.
Bizarrely, his name was Morris.
His name was Morris O'Shea Salazar.
I think that is one of the most extraordinary parts of it. Like,
yeah, so ultimately, we're not sure why or how, but he ended up moving to Kerry, presumably he getting a passport due to the fact he had an Irish father. Then is raised in Killorglin, which is not I think nobody will deny, is definitely not the epicenter of drug.
Turning it to Sinaloa just seems wrong.
Yeah, so beautiful part of the country, of course, and he has a sort of reputation on the streets of Killorglin as a sort of tearaway, bit of a boy racer, getting the odd scrap, but generally quite liked. His family, he has other family there, his mother and a sister who are particularly liked and particularly popular. She just seems to be kind of a hardworking woman trying to hold the family together. So he ends up before the courts a bit in Kerry, relatively minor offences, one of them a bit more serious. I think he gets a few weeks in jail ultimately. And then sometime in his 20s, vanishes off the radar. And
as does his mother.
But they obviously, ultimately, our next word of Morris O'Shea Salazar is when extradition is sought for him. And his name...
Our first word, really.
Yeah.
Because
first
we had
word,
no reason to have known of him.
No.
He was known in his local community. But the media as such, the first we heard of it, we worked back to get the background on him and his mother. But there's a warrant issued.
There's a warrant issued
from Chile.
So there's a warrant issued from Chile, and as part of that warrant, they're seeking, they give out details basically about how he'd been living in Spain, mostly in Barcelona, and running the European, what's described as the European wing of the Sinaloa Cartel.
I think the mother has been before the courts in Chile.
She's at that point is coming before the court. She's charged, and his uncle is also charged. And
we kind of realised that they are actually related to the first wife of Joaquim El Chapo Guzman, who has been festering in a Brooklyn prison since he was very famously tracked down to Mexico, to the hills of Mexico.
Exactly.
Returned to America and jailed for 1,000 years or something. He was the head of the Sinaloa Cartel. Dangerous man, sort of subject of narcos and Netflix, etc. And his sons, the
Chapitos,
were sort of left to run the business. But Morris O'Shea is related in a roundabout way to them, and certainly to the father. And the mother is as well. So it's just not only a link, it's a familial link.
Yes. So I think it's his, Morris O'Shea's mother is linked to Chapito's mother, who's El Chapo's first wife. So what you have, I mean, the story pops up in an Irish-Mexican citizen has been arrested as the head of, or they're seeking his arrest as the head of the Sinaloa Cartel's European wing. And you just think it's just one of these people who somehow end up with an Irish passport.
Yeah.
That, like, that happens all the time. people, I don't know how they get it.
Or they're on fake passports.
They're on fake passports, or sometimes we get reports from abroad, they're Irish, but they'll turn out to be Northern Irish, or they may have had a relative. But he did. But then the other bit of that was, of course, the fact that he was called O'Shea was in his name was unusual. So we reported it as an Irishman, a dual citizen, and then further details emerged of what was the operation, which was effectively they were based in Chile. Maurice O'Shea was directing this criminal organisation, which was shipping huge amounts of cocaine from Chile into Europe. He was doing that on behalf of the Sinaloa Cartel, reporting directly to the Japitos, and had a network across Europe of hauliers and corrupt officials in ports. He was smuggling the cocaine in on legitimate transport ships. It was being marked as fresh fruit and stuff like that. Like really a major criminal figure, and a few, on par with, I suppose, the Kinahan cartel in terms of his output, according to police. So at first it just appeared that this guy had a passport, and it's still an interesting story. But as we look more into it, you find out, well, he actually had lived in Kerry and had really deep roots there. And then ultimately, as we looked into it even further, it became apparent that his ties to Ireland hadn't ceased. They hadn't stopped when he left.
And we had access to those files. Some of those anchors had files and some intelligence files that sort of led us to look at certain individuals in the Kerry area, business people, two of which would later come before the courts.
Yeah.
Certainly one of which who would later come before the courts because of that crystal meth seizure in Cork.
Yeah.
As you were looking into this story, this sort of big...
Well, we had a great special published by Neil Ferreter, who was working with us at the time, and then it sort of within a few days, this big bust occurred in Cork, where a record amount of crystal meth was seized. Crystal meth that wasn't particularly destined for the Irish market. In fact, it was landed in Cork and was then due to be moved on to Australia, where crystal meth is probably the most prominent drug, actually. So what you see ultimately playing out was that this link between Munster and the Sinaloa Cartel had remained, and that it is suspected that there's a good number of people in Ireland were key figures in Maurice O'Shea's operation. And that Ireland which was a sort of novel discovery, that Ireland was being used as a staging point to bring drugs from Mexico into Europe and then down to Australia. And the idea, of course, of that is that the drugs come into Ireland, and then the movement of goods between Ireland and Australia is less suspicious than a ship coming from Sinaloa to Sydney.
I think that whole story as well showed how, drugs know no class.
Yeah.
They will sort of bring together all sorts of people. And I suppose one of the most interesting parts of it was the garden centre in Kerry and Tralee, owned by Nathan MacDonald, as sort of a celebrated businessman from the area.
Yeah, I mean, a guy like, I suppose Nathan MacDonald was one of these people who appeared on Virgin Media a bit, talking about gardening and, home improvements, and had a prominent social media presence, was involved in local businesses. We had a big number of calls saying he was about to be chosen as a general election candidate for Fine Gael, which we actually asked Fine Gael, and they categorically denied it, and absolutely wasn't the case. But he was mixing in those kind of circles, race meetings,
He was somebody who had actually grown up in a family. The mother had worked very hard on a small garden centre. I think there was 5 of them in the family.
Yeah.
And he had taken it over, the garden centre, having spent a stint working abroad, and he'd come back and what was a sort of a small local garden centre suddenly exploded into being this huge big business with a big coffee shop, restaurant.
Yeah, and I mean, I suppose it's kind of like a gentrification of sort of local businesses where
But I think he was looked upon as doing so well and all the rest of it, and he was had that Midas touch that some people look as if they have in business. But behind the scenes, of course, and he pleaded guilty before the Special Criminal Court of his role in all this, he was storing crystal meth on those premises on behalf of the Sinaloa Cartel, who were using Ireland as this sort of
staging post
to go bring it on to Australia. So he was brought before the courts. As the year went on, I don't know how many podcasts we did on it because, he appeared before the courts looking rather like he wasn't doing too well in prison.
Yeah.
And he very quickly sort of wanted to plead guilty even before he was asked to plead. A man who was not used to prison, a man who was not used to courts, a man who, by looking at him a couple of years ago, you would never ever think you'd see him before the Special Criminal Court, but indeed he's there. He's pleaded guilty and he's now awaiting sentencing. But one of the other individuals, of course, that we did see, spot and look at the original time we were looking at this story was James Lean, who remains before the court.
Yeah, he's not
guilty.
Yeah, he's pled not guilty.
Not guilty. So his trial is due to go ahead into next year. And we'll follow that very closely.
Yeah.
The other big story I would have seen for February, of course, was the Canova report.
Yeah.
And this is kind of, from times gone by as such, but Freddie Scappaticci was this Irish IRA member that was named in the Canova report as Steak Knife. Now, he was working in the IRA's internal security unit, and they often just picked up members and tortured them in order to get them to admit that they were working with British intelligence. And all the while, Scappaticci himself was working for British intelligence. He was one of the most high-profile spies they had. Fascinating story, and one which has resulted in a number of books. Look, everybody knew for a long time that Scappaticci was Steak Knife, but the Canova report, I suppose, rubber stamped it, and there was much anticipation for that report. And the Scappaticci story, I suppose, is that where the core of it goes to is how the British state operated in the north. Which, in terms of Scappaticci, he was obviously giving them information about IRA members. He was part of this nutting squad, but really the core of it went to the fact that the British Army. And this is a lot of these inquiries and inquests are focused on this fact that the British government are accused of, and certainly in Scappaticci seems to be justifiably accused, of allowing crimes all the way up to murder to be carried out rather than expose Scappaticci as an agent. And that really is the core of it. I mean, it was a dirty, dirty war, and intelligence gathering for its own sake seemed to have been absolutely symptomatic in the British Army. So they would allow IRA members, and many, many of them are innocent. I mean, that even innocent of what they're accused of, which is informing to the British state. Scappaticci had people killed because they might have suspected him because he didn't like them. He was absolutely a full-on psychopath. Yeah. But the British government knew what he was doing on a day-to-day basis and didn't intervene because they wanted to keep collecting that intelligence. And ultimately, that report showed that Scappaticci gave them very little that was of particular value. I mean, he wasn't giving them great info because the IRA had become quite suspicious of him, and his value as an agent was limited. He was the son of an Italian immigrant, and he sort of, I think he worked as a bricklayer or something up in Belfast for years. He was from the Markets area.
Yeah.
And he sort of wound up living, in exile.
He lived in exile in
Britain.
In the UK. I mean, there was people had tracked him down over the years.
I think he was living in a sort of a flat, and
well, he was actually quite wealthy. I mean, this is the other bit of the Scappaticci story that always causes mystery about where did he get all this money? Was he paid by the state or not? He always, up until his death, denied everything. But of course, he had spoken to journalists before. He'd spoken to a BBC
Cook report.
He'd rang them up and given information, and really I think he seemed to have a grudge against Martin McGuinness and tried to throw Martin McGuinness in it. So look,
a lot of sort of dark stories about his past that I don't think anyone has ever totally got to the bottom of. But you know, you talk to people and the very sinister stuff about, you know, what he had also been doing in his personal life, as well as, I mean, he was a guy who was involved. I mean, some of the stories about what they did to try and get people to admit that they were touts, and many of them probably weren't touts.
Yes,
they
I
just
think that
agreed that they were, because to stop or to die, because they did horrific things to them, and him at the head, neck and tail of it while on the phone to his British agents. I mean, the collusion was just unbelievable.
And Scappaticci, of course, had been convicted in his exile of, you know, having bestiality, pornography and everything like that. So really disturbing psychopathic characters that are quite rare, but I mean, there are some of them that attach themselves to the trouble, to the paramilitaries and the troubles on both sides. Really, really.
You got cover, I suppose, during those years
and,
for that sort of love or whatever that violence does to some people. You know, plenty of people would have got involved in stuff around the troubles, but they did it for, they would argue and convincingly argue they did it for a greater cause, whereas there was plenty of other people who were there because they just loved to inflict violence on other human beings, and I think he was definitely one of them. Anyway, onwards to March. So what are you seeing here in March? We had Pater Keating fighting against his extradition to the UK again. That is something that has culminated in his sentence in recent weeks, and he's back in Ireland, in Portlaoise, having had a sort of a little trip over to the UK, faced the courts, faced charges, pleaded guilty, got a sentence, ran concurrent, and he's back here in Portlaoise to serve it, having completely cut ties with his former boss, Thomas Bomber Kavanagh. But that comes later, so we'll, you know, that was just the beginning of that story about Pater Keating and Bomber Kavanagh at that stage.
It's interesting to see one of our episodes here, the grooming of children by drugs gangs.
I think that's the top episode of that month. Yeah.
Now, so we obviously talk a lot about the personalities involved in crime, the Kinahans, the Hutches, whatever you want to say. But I suppose there is and that's the aspect of the impact of organised crime or drugs crime in Ireland. You know, this obviously struck a chord in this case because this is a discussion about how it's on the back of an EU report about how children are being groomed, is the word they used, into criminality from a very early age, from the age of, you know, under 12. That lifestyle it becomes a part of them, that they effectively are adopted by drugs gangs and sent into that life to take a lot of the risks. And see, this is the other aspect of organised crime, where there is, on some level, there's people selling drugs and buying drugs, and it's kind of adults in transactions. But I mean, I'm only just this week have got a call from somebody parents of a child who it's been demanded of them, you know, a 5-figure sum for a drug debt that their son has run up. I mean, these people are absolutely respectable, normal people.
And terrified.
Absolutely terrified, and justifiably terrified, because their son's life is in danger. I mean, I can't tell them your son isn't going to be hurt. They are going to have to make radical changes to their whole life to pay off this debt. I mean, it is.
And are they going to pay off the debt? Because if they pay it off, they'll come back for more.
Well, you see, this is it. So, I mean, do you take that chance? Do you let
I have to say, and I've had so many calls from people around the country. I get them all the time, and I'm not qualified to advise people on what to do. But what I do advise them to do is go to the guards and let them step in to help, because they have really good liaison officers. They give really good advice to them. You pay a drug debt and they'll be back for more the next day. That is the problem with it. You are not dealing with honourable characters. It's not simple. Like, I'm not saying it's simple, pay, you know, go to the guards and it'll all be solved. But I do not, you know, think that you raise funds, you pay them off, and that's the end of your problem. Like, usually a kid, a teenager or a young person in their 20s who has run up that drug debt is likely to do it again as well.
You see, you're right. I'm not saying anything you say is wrong. but it's complicated when people are in there. If they live in that community, going to the guards is a complicated decision to make. I mean, if somebody came to my door, I'd go to the guards, no doubt about it. But for other people, it's complicated. You know, the guards have put in put in a policy. I think it's called DRIVE, drug-related intimidation. I can't remember the exact name of the units, but in this case, you know, they're people can feel that the guards are not going to be there 24 hours a day outside your house with a car, and you know, that is the other reality, isn't it? The under-resourced. So people are in a terrible position. That's all I'm saying. But yeah, it does. You're right. There is a specific. It's not a unit as such. I think there are individuals in each sort of Garda station. If you're living in Finglas or whatever, there'll be a ranking officer, maybe a sergeant or an inspector, who will be the drive kind of point of contact. And so they have them in each individual station, and you can go and speak to that person and speak, I suppose, confidentially. But look, it's a huge problem.
It's terrifying for people.
And I mean,
of course, their cars are getting blown up in the middle of the night.
Absolutely.
Their houses are getting firebombed. You know,
and
they're living in terror, and of course, they're, you know, a lot of the reasons behind it is because a young person has made stupid bloody decisions.
Exactly. And I mean, once those debts start racking up, I mean, you're talking about an absolutely phenomenal amount of money people can.
And that brings us to another one of the top episodes of March of this year, where Barry Young's ex-girlfriend, Katie Banks, got a suspended sentence, right? But actually, I'm not so interested in Katie Banks, more interested in Barry Young, because he's this drug dealer from the Sligo area. He's in prison. He pleaded guilty to directing a criminal organisation. He used very heavy-handed tactics.
And that is
he actually was somebody who even brought down help from some notoriously dangerous people from Dublin to come and help him look for drug debts. He wouldn't let somebody away with £100 debt.
No. And you see, this is the other thing, of course. Like, you think of it from the victim's point of view, but from the gangland criminal's point of view, if you start letting anything go, people aren't going to pay. So Barry Young is a very interesting example because he seemed to have done all his business by WhatsApp, bizarrely, which were then recovered. I mean, amazingly. You know, wasn't encrypted devices or anything, just WhatsApped, I'm going to, you know, whatever. But what he was doing was, there was sort of freelance enforcers operating in Dublin. And if he needed a drug debt called, he wouldn't send one of his own guys who was going to be recognised, who was possibly going to be tracked by CCTV. He would hire somebody he didn't even know from Dublin. And there seems to have been a pool of guys there. They would go down, try and collect the debt, and go back to Dublin. And the chances then of somebody recognising them are almost zero. The chances of them being tracked in the local area by police are almost zero. And, you know, that's how it works. And you're right, it was threats of murder, you know, vicious intimidation. And I think one of them was for €300 or €400. I mean, tiny amounts of money. So yeah, that is the real dark side of the business, I suppose. You know, and that is the one we get the calls of, and it never fails to sort of shock me, you know.
No, it's horrendous. By April, we're looking at Christy Kinahan Senior, not for his links to criminality, but for his interests in leaving reviews about food, about hotels he'd stayed in, etc. We had a very interesting discussion about him at that time. So that story came out of Bellingcat
and the Sunday Times.
And the Sunday Times,
yeah.
Okay. And it was basically, they had discovered that Senior, or an account they believed was linked to him, I think it was probably the Christopher Vincent account, had left numerous reviews of hotels, as I said, of restaurants, of cinemas, I think, and various things like that. And in some cases, they said Christopher Vincent had taken photographs and captured himself accidentally in mirrors and corridors of hotels, etc. And on the face of it, it looked as if you could track where Christy Kinahan Senior had been throughout a period of time. I can't remember exactly what date it was. It was probably, I think it was just prior to EncroChat 2019 maybe.
Yeah.
Now, my feeling on it was a little bit more suspicious maybe because I don't know whether Christy Kinahan Sr. is going to get caught doing something like that. I don't think anything is terribly simple or straightforward or black and white with him. And I would have thought he was doing it for a particular reason. He had it set up. Don't believe he was travelling around Europe as well as everywhere else, because of course that was really the key to it, that was he in and out of Europe. Well, certainly the police do not believe he has been travelling around Europe.
Yeah, well, I mean, he's not a wanted man. I mean, that's that. I mean,
his face is on a poster from the US Treasury with a $5 million bounty over his head.
It is.
So
but
he's a wanted man.
But he's not, certainly in the time that's being referred to there, he wasn't facing any criminal charges or sanctioned by the US at that point. We do know he from our own stories about his use of LinkedIn, that he was a prolific sort of internet troll, maybe, or certainly liked to, give his views on world politics. We had a lot of stuff about COVID, a lot of stuff about Putin and the invasion of Ukraine. He was very, invested in writing comments about that on LinkedIn. So that
was a time that he was, putting himself forward as this aviation expert and trying to do business perhaps in those countries that he
Possibly so. I mean, like anything is possible. Of course, what I mean is he could have travelled to Europe.
Yeah.
He wouldn't have automatically been arrested. We do know that has used fake passports a lot. There's no suggestion he's ever come back to Ireland during that time. But if you think of some of those times, even as the feud had begun, or in advance of the Hutch Kinahan feud, Daniel and Christopher Jr., for example, were flying back to Ireland regularly. So look, it was fascinating anyway. But he has a kind of I do believe that from looking at his LinkedIn posts and looking at those reviews, the tone and language was quite similar. He is certainly grammatically correct, which is a unique feature of Christopher Senior's relative to the Hutch faction, who are, when they put up social media posts, tend not to be as grammatically correct. And he also has a kind of a cranky tone, does he, Christy Senior?
Yeah, he's a crankpot, I'd say.
Yeah, giving out about stuff and, not impressed with bad service and, so all of that. But it's fascinating anyway. I mean, it was a really interesting story, I thought, I have to say.
Now, interestingly, May, we spoke about the grooming of children. That was a Europol report. And I think they actually, for the first time, in that report, described children as being radicalised by drug gangs. By May, our top episode was Europe's Most Dangerous Criminal Gangs, which I do believe was a Europol report.
Yeah.
And it was talking about who they were, what sort of crimes they were involved in, and the statistics of those that were, say, for example, involved in human trafficking. And, it was a kind of a more general discussion. So it's interesting that was of big interest. Of course, I do think that we recognise ourselves as part of a bigger, organised crime is so global.
Yeah.
You can't look at it just in Ireland and
which you could have
to understand it. You have to look at it firstly from a European point of view, and then globally and politically and economically. I think try and kind of get to grips with what exactly it is.
I think you're seeing the sort of specialisation has occurred across Europe. Probably there was always a degree of specialisation, but at some point, criminal gangs in Ireland were, they were doing everything. But we've seen certainly this year, and some of them are before the courts. For example, an Eastern European gang who are solely money couriers, effectively, and that's what they do. They're not doing all of the other bits of the business. They're in charge of collecting money, getting it out of the country, washing it, and giving clean money back to the criminals. And that's their operation. We also had an example of people who were brought in facing charges again in relation to weapons, who effectively were a one-shop stop for weapons dealing. Now, no doubt these criminals can get up to other things as well, but there's a specialisation across Europe. And we saw with some of the major shipments that like the MV Matthew, that you see that there's logistic experts in bringing drugs across to Europe. The people pool resources, and look, the EncroChat ultimately exposed all of that these networks have, they're absolutely cross-border. I mean, there's just no doubt about it.
And of course, the same month, we come back to the sort of basics of organised crime and how it affects people on the streets and young people when we have our first gangland murder of the year, and that's Josh Itzelli.
Yeah. I mean, Josh Itzelli was a young man. I think he was 20 when he was killed. He ultimately died as a result of being shot by an AK, is it an AK-47? It was a machine gun, effectively, an army machine gun. It might not be actually, an AK-47.
It was one of those semi-automatic.
Semi-automatic
In other
rifle.
Words, when you pull the trigger,
a number of shots.
Yeah,
so
it's kind of spray.
Yeah, it's an army an army rifle, effectively. So this guy, Josh Itzelli, he was facing charges in relation to crack cocaine dealing, but a very young man from an African background, but who lived in Ireland all his life. And what you see was this sort of feud occurring around Dublin's south inner city, involving a dispute between two gangs of very, very young men. Now, while there would have been one point in Irish history maybe where these guys would have ended up punching each other out in a pub, these young guys had access to this weapon effectively. The issue that arises here is that even at that level, that people can get access to these sort of weapons. And what we think happened, and obviously charges haven't been brought or cases haven't been made, but there was certainly, it appears that he may have been shot by accident by one of his own associates after their car was rammed, and the weapon, which they clearly would not be trained how to use or how to store or how to maintain, may have gone off, and Josh Itzelli may have been killed in error. But very tragic case, of a young man whose life is absolutely wasted.
I suppose as June started, there's this, we sort of, I suppose, as a media lurch to, Kinahan Cartel faced massive blow, and then blah 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 blah, But of course, the Kinahan Cartel had faced a massive blow when one of their bankers, Johnny Morrissey, was arrested in Spain. It was a really significant story when it had happened, and he was put into custody. And we were told that the Spanish authorities believed he'd laundered something like €200 million of Kinahan drug money. And he'd been using this system, an ancient system called Hawala.
Yes, very good.
Yeah.
Because you used to slag me off whenever I got it wrong, and now I've perfected it. Oh, you just be smart arse to me,
I was actually wondering, was that word going to come out of my brain?
Exactly. It looked kind of. It looked like it wasn't.
I was really winging it and hoping to God you'd help me there.
No, I was gonna pounce on you if you got it. I was gonna pounce on you if you got it wrong.
There, isn't there?
Well, look, keep you on your toes.
Anyway, so Morrissey's jailed, and there's, hoopla and merriment, and oh my goodness, they've got to the bottom of the Kinahan drug money and blah. And of course, June, he walks free on the Costa del Crime.
Yeah.
Now, that was the headline. Certainly that was what we were talking about. But of course, the Spanish system, as we have to talk about quite a lot, because a lot of Irish and, because of the Kinahan links to Spain and other criminals' links to Spain, we often find ourselves sort of trying to report on the Spanish system. And what they do is they put people before the courts and into custody while they're still investigating them.
Yeah.
I mean, Gerry Hutch later in the year was arrested, placed in custody, and then released to go forward to return here to run for general election, actually. But it was the same situation, under suspicion, still being investigated. the suspects are put before the court and the magistrates kind of go through whatever the police investigators have uncovered. But at some point, those suspects are able to apply for bail because it's simply against human rights to keep somebody behind bars in prison, as an investigation could last for, God knows how many years. Especially complex are the money laundering investigations, and the Spanish appear to be particularly bad at them.
Well, yeah, we don't know the ins and outs of everything that goes on, but all we know is that of all the criminals, the Irish criminals that have ended up in Spain and have been investigated for criminal activities over there, and they are many, it certainly was the prime location for Irish criminals, they really don't seem to end up in prison unless they're caught red-handed. So we've had obviously a lot of people that are in Spanish jails, such as James Quinn, such as Eric Lucky Wilson, but they've tended to be caught red-handed committing a criminal act, shootings in this case. None of the Irish expats, certainly that we've ever written about, have ended up in prison for those kind of hands-off criminal activities. So we've seen in Ireland a real break from the norm in the last decade, where key Kinahan figures were going to jail, and most of them went to jail for crimes like facilitating the operation of a criminal gang, for various kind of money laundering effects, where we've been able to put together these, I suppose, something like the RICO prosecutions that exist in the US, where, you don't have to catch the mafia guy shooting the other mafia guy to put him in prison. But in Spain, that seems to be much more difficult. Johnny Morrissey, when he got out of prison, he had slimmed down and he was celebrating, with a bottle of champagne, and life does seem to go on. I suppose a lot of our view is determined by Operation Shovel, where certainly the Spanish police put out a lot of information about the Kinahans back in 2010, including about land being purchased across the world, money being moved, cars being bought, but they didn't seem to be able to make any of it stick. So, yeah, it's you have to be a bit skeptical about Johnny Morrissey, whether he'll ever, face the ultimate sanction. But who knows?
Of course, more proof that plenty of the characters that we discuss and we talk about and we, come up against and watch them in court, their stories continue. Jonathan Dowdall's house went up for sale. And we were able to go behind the whole door because we were able to take a virtual tour, weren't we? On the
we were. I mean, it wasn't a great achievement. We sort of logged on to daft.ie.
I thought it was one of our best.
It was. And, no, but I suppose
we were able to sort of comment on his taste and what the house looked like. And
I mean, a bizarre kind of. I mean, you love dogs. I love dogs myself, but I can't And actually, I'm going to get myself in real trouble here, but Jonathan Dowdall had a bizarre obsession with fish, obviously. And nothing wrong with
big things, those big koi.
Koi, they're called. Yeah, no, don't have the koi community is going to come and get you.
I'll tell you why, because we bought a house at one stage and there was a fish pond in the back garden, right, which sort of came with the house. Like a dog, you bring it with you.
Yeah.
So we bought this bloody house and there's this fish pond in the back garden. And I realised after we moved in, there was fish, like lots of these big motherfuckers. Right?
Yeah.
And I personally find them a little bit disgusting. I just don't. But at the same time, I wouldn't be cruel to any animal.
No.
And I was thinking, oh my God, like, how do you feed these? What do you have to do? Do you have to clean out this water?
Yeah, but you do, I would imagine.
Probably do.
Yeah.
And thankfully, actually, I only had a dog and no children at the time because this pond was lethal.
Yeah.
Absolutely huge, big thing. But this bird used to come constantly. There was all this sort of dirty netting stuff on it. Actually, I removed it because I thought it didn't look very nice, and I sort of tried to tidy it up a little bit and sort of, hello, koi, I'll have to try and feed you. I think I probably bought something in the fish shop or in the pet shop. And this bird used to come and sit there and
pick them off.
Well, he was obviously doing that. I didn't realise. I only realised afterwards when I
don't know if that
Googled
would
the thing. It was a
stand up-
heron.
That might stand up in a Spanish court, but I don't know if it stand up in an Irish. I think we should move on now.
It was a heron, yeah. But anyway,
No.
so yes, they're big orange things or big white things, and they're big. Yeah, some people just find them absolutely
Well, Jonathan
fascinating.
Dowdall
And Jonathan Dowdall is one of those people.
because he had a very big fish tank in his house, but he also had this massive artificial pond at the back. I mean, a really, really big thing. But yeah, the Jonathan Dowdall thing, people are endlessly fascinated with his decisions in life and how it's been received. It's just, he just was such
Like the fish.
like the fish. Yeah, like the fish person.
Endlessly fascinated
Yeah,
by
yeah.
Jonathan Dowdall's liking of koi fish.
Yeah, yeah.
Anyway, listen, on that note, let's just take a break and we'll come back for part 2. I'm Nicola Tallant and you're watching Crime World, a podcast about criminals, drugs and the underworld in Ireland and across the globe. Make sure you subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you can be the first to watch all our latest episodes. You can also listen wherever you get your podcasts.